I'm very proud of the bill we tabled today, and I think it represents values, our values.
It is unthinkable to me that in a free society we would legitimize discrimination against citizens based on their religion.
I think a liberal society based on fundamental freedoms and openness must always protect fundamental individual rights.
This law that's being proposed is something that divides the population, that divides the province instead of bringing people together.
Lots of reaction today to the Quebec government tabling its secularism bill. As we told you earlier in the show, this would see public workers in positions of authority banned from wearing religious symbols. It also invokes the notwithstanding clause. So is Ottawa preparing for a fight here with Quebec? How will this legislation impact the debate, for instance, in the federal election? Chantal Hébert is in Montreal tonight, Andrew Coyne in Toronto, and Althea Raj also there in Toronto tonight. Good to see everybody. Chantal, I'll start with you because you're there, you're in Quebec. The Premier says that this is an attempt to unite Quebecers. I'm not sure I understand how that would be. So what do you think he means when he suggests that this is going to unite people in that province?
I'm not sure about uniting, but for sure he believes he has a mandate that was front and center in his election platform. And he is the third government in a row, after a Liberal and a PQ government, to come up with a version of a law that deals with the same areas. So Mr. Legault feels he's on a fairly large consensus that people want the Quebec government to be affirming its secular state in a way that actually targets, in this case, individuals. And I think what he probably also meant is by using the notwithstanding clause, he's sheltering his law from a lot of court challenges, and so he's getting, he thinks, the debate over with.
And is that fair to say, Andrew, that there's nothing really else that can be done?
We don't know. We don't know what's going to happen in Quebec. We don't know what's going to happen federally. It's certainly, he can claim a mandate. There's no doubt about it. Sometimes minority rights are not particularly popular with the majority in any society. That's why we have things like the Charter of Rights to protect them. That's why that's such a danger to give governments things like the notwithstanding clause. This is now the second government after the government of Ontario to trot this out in very specious circumstances. And it ought to give us a lot of pause on this, because if the courts can't stop this, then that's been our backstop in recent decades. And we've got some decisions to make as a society of what are going to be the terms on which we live together, what's the terms of our federal union, if this kind of thing can go on.
Yeah, except, as both of you pointed out, and Althea, I'll put it to you, he did get a mandate for it. It was clear that he was going to move ahead with it, that the legislation was going to be perhaps clearer than we had seen in the past. So it makes it hard, does it not, Althea, for someone to say you shouldn't do this, even if people may not think it's fair or right?
Yeah, and I think the other point to that is that the majority of Quebecers do support this piece of legislation. So I think he can accurately say that he is trying to, or he hopes that he's trying to unite people over this idea. Quebecers have voted for this, and they tell the public opinion polls that pollsters that this is something that they support. I think where it gets a bit trickier is what the federal government's response to this is. And I don't think there is an appetite to talk about disallowance and the federal government's role in getting rid of this piece of legislation in Quebec, but it does put the parties in an interesting position in the lead up to a federal election. Mr. Scheer perhaps more than most, because he's hoping to pick up a lot of the seats that the CAQ won in the last election campaign. And we've seen both Conservative MPs in Quebec and New Democrat MPs in Quebec not go with the party line on minority religious issues. And so I think that causes a bit of problems when it comes to caucus management and candidate management as well.
But let's get away from, let's get away from the dry politics of it, though. Do we want to live in a society that tells observant members of religious minorities you cannot work in positions of authority in the public service? It was particularly poignant, I think, seeing Jagmeet Singh, the federal NDP leader, speaking on this, because this bill would prohibit the leader of the federal NDP from working in a position of authority in the public service in Quebec. Is that the kind of society? Are these the terms on which we're going to live together? Is that kind of the kind of discrimination against religious minorities that we're prepared to countenance.
Okay,
but is there an appetite for the federal government to do anything about it?
Yes,
yes,
okay, yes. Okay,
so we still live, and we can have a debate over whether the notwithstanding clause should exist, but we do live in a rule of law environment, and in that environment, what the Quebec government is doing is both constitutional and legal.
Yep.
The other point I would bring is that this debate in Quebec has been ongoing for 10 years.
Yes.
Everyone has had their say again and again and again, and this is where we are today. And I would argue that over those 10 years, very few minds were changed one way or another. So this discussion that is restarting will probably end sooner rather than later because everyone has had their say.
But,
now,
yeah.
federally, I looked at those three leaders today of the main parties, and I didn't see a lot of light between what they said. And to me, that basically means that together they are neutralizing the issue in the next federal campaign, because none of them is going to be coming to Quebec saying, I'm nicer about this than the next guy. And the reason for that is that there are a lot of voters in Canada and in Quebec who actually do not want someone to be dancing with a government on issues like that. Andrew Scheer on this was categorical. I think he's the only one who needed to say it, that he as Prime Minister would never do something like that. It was obvious that Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau would not.
Is there not the right for a federal government to say, as Andrew's suggesting, we don't want our country to turn into pockets of acceptance or not?
Well, whether they will or not, of course, is a different question. But look, this was part of the terms of Confederation. This long predates the Charter of Rights. Long before there was a charter, the idea was the federal government would protect local minorities from the depredations of local majorities. Have we given up on that idea? Are we just basically going to shrug our shoulders and say what happens in someone's backyard is they're not really part of our society? We don't really care. You can just basically do it and basically enunciate the principle of provincial rights, and the rest of us just have to look the other way. Is that this will be a decision. This will be a test.
Yes,
and maybe we'll all just shrug and say it's fine. It's just religious minorities. It doesn't concern us.
But what is your solution?
Well, that's the first thing before the solution is to say, is it even our business? And a lot of people are prepared to say, it's not our business. It's just happening in Quebec, so therefore it doesn't matter to the rest of Canada. So let's have that debate first, and then we can decide what kinds of measures are in order.
But when you say it is your business, then you need to have a policy
it's not
answer.
Enough to say I care.
I really don't think we're going to have a discussion about disallowance before the next federal election.
Okay, that's a good conversation. Let's move to the other thing that we've been talking about for weeks and weeks and weeks now. The SNC controversy affair, it seems to, in spite of everything, continue along. And this week it moved into this other area around leaks of other things. Here's what the Prime Minister had to say on that today.
First of all, we condemn the number of leaks that have happened recently of confidential information that has been let out over the past weeks. I certainly would wish that people who have access to confidential information would keep it confidential.
I want to attack this from the perspective of what is the damage that is done to institutions, to people's confidence in democracy, from any of those things when we see the story shift to questions about judicial appointments and other information that gets leaked out there from someone. We don't know where. Do you want to tackle that, Andrew?
Well, the leaks are obviously denounced by everybody, including the people who have been engaging. It's a pretty short list of people who could have leaked this. I don't think leaking itself is the issue. I think it matters what you're leaking for. In the same way, when we give anonymity to sources, it matters why they want anonymity, what they're doing. Leaking information where you're blowing the whistle on wrongdoing, it seems to me, is distinguishable from leaking information to smear the whistleblower. And I think people have to be able to make these reasoned distinctions between these situations. But again, all of this is essentially designed to distract from the central question, which is not what was Jody Wilson's record as Attorney General, Minister of Justice, what were her motivations. But the central question, which we still do not have an answer to, which is, what was the government of Canada doing trying to interfere in a criminal prosecution?
Except if that is part of the story, the motivation.
Yes, no? And I think both questions are legitimate. Sure. Yes, we want to know more about what people have to say about SNC-Lavalin that may be relevant to that particular issue. But if part of the argument is that the Attorney General was fired, demoted, shifted on account of SNC-Lavalin, it also informs the debate that there could have been other reasons. The Supreme Court leak, I find it regrettable when people's names are brought in that applied for positions under confidentiality. Yes. That being said, I heard about the fact that there was a difference of opinion without the specifics on this very issue at the Supreme Court long before SNC-Lavalin landed on Jody Wilson-Raybauld's desk. And it was on that basis that the day after the shuffle I said on this show that the relationship between the Prime Minister and the Justice Minister had soured over the course of a number of files. I knew nothing about SNC-Lavalin then, so it does inform why she was shuffled, and there seems to be general agreement that had she not been moved, we would not be talking about SNC-Lavalin.
Althea, what are your concerns when you see that kind of information coming out, and also people's names being dragged into a story that has nothing to do with them, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, that's really unfortunate that you apply for a job and that everybody knows that you applied for a job. That probably should not happen in the federal government. But I think deeper, though, when it comes to the Supreme Court, you don't want to move to, I think most Canadians would agree, they don't want to move to a system like the United States where we recognize or we think that this judge is a conservative judge and this judge is a big L liberal judge. And I think part of what was leaked spoke to where the Prime Minister's office and where those players who are making those decisions, where they were pigeonholing those justices, and that is a big risk. When it comes to the relationship between Jody Wilson-Raybould and the Prime Minister's office, yes, I agree with Chantal. It was, I mean, actually, there were newspaper stories about the debate with regards to the justices. But when leaks do happen, they do help illuminate the conversation. Part of the leak earlier this week with regards to Jody Wilson-Raybauld's pleading for Justice Joyal to join the top court was that she had written a 60-page memo. Well, that's a little bit of detail, but it goes to illuminate Gerald Butts' testimony where he said, well, I couldn't understand why she didn't ever put anything in writing about any of her concerns because we were so used to getting all these lengthy memos. Oh, well, you know, that's a little bit of detail that it's not really part of the story, but it helps understand the process and what was really happening behind the scenes.
I have to let Andrew take the last word.
We haven't seen that 60-page memo. We have their word for it. But again, these are peripheral questions. Even the question of whether she was fired for resisting the Prime Minister's pressure on her to lean on the prosecutor is a secondary question. The main question, which is actually not denied, is that they pressured her. All that we're engaged in the debate is them saying it's okay to pressure her because we were concerned about jobs, or it's okay to pressure her because we only did it 20 times, or all these attempts to try and muddy the central question. So, as I say, we keep chasing down these back alleys and rabbit holes about things that aren't actually central to the questions.
But you agree with what you agree. I think what you said off the top was the important thing, that if sources are going to be leaking information like this, it would be good to at least understand where they're coming from.
And they certainly shouldn't be leaking things, not just that bring the judge's name into it, but that imply he's some kind of extremist who can't be trusted with the Charter of Rights. They besmirched his good name and by extension tried to make her look erratic in the process. And there's no foundation to that whatsoever.
Although a leak followed the next day that looked like it came from a different side. Anyway, okay, I got to leave it there. I imagine we'll talk about this again. Thank you all. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to @Issue the podcast. Look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.